It's March 23rd, 1944, somewhere on a dark country lane outside a French village whose name will not appear in any surviving report. A German half-track idles at a crossroads, its commander leaning out to scan the hedgerows with a torch that does little against the moonless dark. Somewhere behind those hedgerows, a small charge fires with a crack that sounds, unmistakably, like a rifle shot. The half-track's machine gun answers at once, chewing into empty brambles for a full 30 seconds. Nothing falls, nothing screams. There was never anyone there. 100 meters further down the lane, 2 resistance fighters are already gone, melting into a ditch they scouted the previous afternoon, while the Germans empty their belts into nothing. This was not luck. This was design. The device that fired that single, decisive crack weighed less than a bar of soap, cost almost nothing to manufacture, and was carried in pockets, in bicycle saddlebags, in the linings of coats. It was built by an organization that did not officially exist, for a kind of war that conventional armies had never needed to fight before, and it turned the ordinary darkness of the French countryside into something the occupying forces could never quite trust again. This is the story of the time-delay decoy charge and the wider deception toolkit developed by Britain's Special Operations Executive, the unglamorous, unassuming devices that did not blow up bridges or kill soldiers, but instead did something arguably more valuable in an occupied country. They made an entire army doubt its own eyes and ears. Convince a garrison that danger might be anywhere, and you do not need to be everywhere. You only need to be believed. By the early years of the German occupation of France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, a peculiar military problem had emerged that no general staff had fully planned for. The occupying garrisons were enormous, numbering in the hundreds of thousands across Western Europe, but they were spread desperately thin across thousands of kilometers of rural road, rail line, and coastline. Conventional military doctrine assumed that strength came from concentration, masses of men and armor brought to bear at a single point. But an occupying force cannot concentrate. It must occupy everywhere at once, guarding every culvert, every signal box, every stretch of telephone wire, with a fraction of the men such total coverage would actually require. The resistance movements forming in response to this occupation faced the mirror image of the problem. They were small, often desperately underarmed, and almost entirely without the artillery, armor, or air support that conventional warfare assumed as a baseline. A resistance cell in rural France might number a dozen people with 2 or 3 pre-war hunting rifles and whatever had been parachuted in under cover of darkness. They could not fight a German company in open battle and survive it. They did not need to. What they needed was a way to make a vastly superior force behave as though it were under constant threat, to pin down men and resources that would otherwise be sent to the front, without ever risking the kind of direct confrontation that would see resistance fighters killed in job lots. The numbers tell their own story. Estimates of German occupation forces tied down on internal security duties across occupied Western Europe ran into the hundreds of thousands of men, soldiers who were, by definition, not available for the Eastern Front or for the defense of the Atlantic coastline. Keeping those men there, keeping them nervous, exhausted, and firing at shadows, was itself a strategic achievement, even when not a single German soldier was harmed in the process. The problem was that achieving this kind of pinning effect through real ambushes was extraordinarily costly. Every genuine firefight risked the lives of irreplaceable trained operatives and invited brutal reprisals against civilian populations, reprisals that were already a horrifying feature of occupation policy. What was needed was a way to manufacture the threat of attack without the attack itself, a way to make a few rifle cracks in the dark do the work of an entire ambush party, and to do it again and again, in different places, without ever quite letting the enemy catch up with where the next one would come from. This is the problem that landed, among many others, on the desks of the engineers and chemists working for Britain's Special Operations Executive, an organization formed in 1940 specifically to wage what Winston Churchill reportedly termed ungentlemanly warfare. SOE's research and development arm operated out of several requisitioned country houses, most famously Station 9 at the Frythe in Welwyn, Hertfordshire, a sprawling Victorian estate that had been turned almost overnight into one of the strangest weapons laboratories in British history. The scientists and engineers there, drawn from chemistry departments, toy manufacturers, and the film industry as readily as from conventional ordnance backgrounds, were not being asked to build better tanks or bigger guns. They were being asked to solve an entirely different kind of equation: how to make one person, with one pocketful of cheap components, generate the battlefield presence of an entire infantry section. The device that emerged, broadly known to operatives as the time delay incendiary or decoy charge depending on its exact configuration, worked on a principle that was almost insultingly simple once explained, which was rather the point. At its heart sat a small pencil-shaped fuse, often referred to informally as a time pencil, containing a thin copper tube filled with a cupric chloride solution and a spring-loaded striker held back by a thin wire. When an operative crushed the tube's tip, the corrosive solution began eating through the restraining wire at a rate that could be predicted within a reasonably narrow window, anywhere from 10 minutes to several hours depending on which colored pencil variant was selected, each color calibrated to a different delay. When the wire finally parted, the striker snapped forward onto a percussion cap, and that in turn could be wired to detonate almost anything the operative wished, from a demolition charge to, in this case, something far smaller and far cleverer. For pure deception, rather than demolition, the charge attached to that fuse needed only to be loud, not destructive. SOE supplied small explosive devices roughly the size and weight of a fountain pen or a thick cigar, sometimes disguised within everyday objects entirely, that produced a sound closely approximating rifle fire when they detonated. Some variants were built to fire in rapid, irregular bursts, designed by engineers who had clearly spent time listening to actual small arms exchanges and understood that real gunfire is never evenly spaced. A length of safety fuse or a sequence of timed pencils could be arranged to produce 3 or 4 cracks over the span of a minute, then silence. Then another burst from a slightly different angle if a second device had been placed nearby. To a German patrol straining to listen in the dark, this was not one firework. It was, to every instinct trained into a soldier, the unmistakable sound of an ambush beginning to unfold from multiple directions at once. The manufacturing itself was deliberately unglamorous. Components were produced through a network of small workshops and contracted manufacturers across Britain, many of them firms with no obvious wartime function, their owners sworn to official secrecy under wartime regulations. Time pencils were manufactured in their hundreds of thousands across the war as a whole, since the same fuse mechanism armed everything from limpet mines to demolition charges to the decoy devices themselves, and exact production figures for the decoy variants specifically remain difficult to pin down, scattered as they are across surviving SOE stores' ledgers that were never designed with future historians in mind. What is clear from the available records is that these devices were cheap enough and small enough to be issued without rationing them as though they were artillery shells, which was, again, the entire design philosophy behind them. Getting these devices into the hands of resistance networks was its own quiet triumph of logistics. They traveled inside hollowed-out books, false-bottomed suitcases, and the cargo holds of Halifax and Lysander aircraft making moonlit drops into French and Belgian fields, marked only by torchlight signals from reception committees on the ground. Once distributed, a single resistance cell could carry enough decoy charges in a coat pocket to simulate a fighting strength many times its actual size, an asymmetry between weight carried and threat projected that conventional military hardware simply could not match. The training that accompanied these devices mattered almost as much as the devices themselves. Operatives passed through SOE's network of country house schools in Scotland and southern England, where instructors taught not just how to crush a time pencil's tip or wire a percussion cap, but how to think like the men who would be listening for the result. Recruits learned to study the patrol patterns of the specific garrison they intended to deceive, noting which crossroads were favored for checkpoints, which hedgerows offered the kind of cover a real ambush would actually use, and what time of night fatigue and reduced visibility worked most in the operative's favor. A decoy placed without this groundwork might produce a satisfying bang and achieve nothing. A decoy placed with proper reconnaissance could hold an entire platoon in place for hours. The device was simple. The doctrine built around it was not, and SOE instructors spent considerable effort ensuring that the cleverness of the engineering at Station 9 was matched by an equally careful approach to when and where that engineering was actually used. There was also a quieter sophistication in how multiple devices could be layered to build an entire false narrative across a single night. A resistance cell might place one decoy charge timed to detonate at midnight near a known checkpoint, drawing a patrol's attention, followed by a second charge 20 minutes later and 400 meters further along the same road, timed precisely to suggest that whoever had fired the first shots was now retreating, or worse, regrouping. A third device, further off still and using a different sound profile if one was available, could imply the arrival of reinforcements on the attacking side, the very last thing an already stretched garrison wanted to contemplate at 2 in the morning. None of this required a single resistance fighter to remain anywhere near the scene. The entire fictional battle unfolded entirely through timed chemistry, while the men who had engineered it were, by design, several kilometers away and fast asleep. What this meant in practice, on the ground in occupied France and Belgium, is recorded only in fragments, because the people best placed to describe it were, by the nature of the work, not in the habit of writing detailed after-action reports that might fall into the wrong hands. But the fragments that do survive, in SOE debriefing notes and in the post-war recollections of former resistance members, describe a consistent pattern. A handful of decoy charges, set on timers and placed along a stretch of road or rail line that German patrols were known to favor, would detonate in sequence long after the operatives who planted them had cycled home and gone to bed. German units would respond exactly as trained, deploying in force, calling up reinforcements, sometimes holding a position through an entire freezing night waiting for an attack that had already, in every meaningful sense, finished hours before it began. The devices found a second related use that deserves its own mention, in protecting resistance fighters during their own genuine operations rather than purely as standalone decoys. A sabotage team withdrawing from a successful demolition might leave a delayed decoy charge behind them on their escape route, timed to detonate perhaps 40 minutes after they had passed, drawing any pursuing patrol's fire and attention towards a hedge or ditch the saboteurs had already left far behind. In this configuration, the device functioned less as a phantom battle and more as a kind of acoustic rear guard, buying the only thing that mattered to an operative on the run, which was time, measured in the same currency the chemistry inside the time pencil itself was already counting down. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs considerably less than a time pencil. The psychological toll of this is harder to quantify than a body count, but it was, by the testimony of those who experienced it, genuinely corrosive to morale. Garrison troops who have been called out 3 nights running to chase gunfire that resolves into nothing begin to doubt every sound the countryside offers them. They become exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the particular fatigue of constant, unresolved threat. Some accounts describe German units becoming reluctant to fully investigate reported contacts, sending smaller patrols than doctrine called for simply because previous responses had cost sleep and yielded nothing, which was, from the resistance perspective, an outcome very nearly as useful as a genuine ambush would have been, achieved at a fraction of the risk. It would be wrong to suggest the British were alone in recognizing the value of acoustic and visual deception. The German military maintained its own deception units, and on the Eastern Front in particular, Wehrmacht engineers experimented with dummy artillery positions, recorded sound effects played through loudspeakers, and inflatable tank decoys intended to mislead Soviet reconnaissance about the disposition of armored reserves. These efforts, however, were generally conceived at a much larger scale, aimed at convincing enemy commanders and aerial reconnaissance about the location of entire formations, rather than at the intimate, close-quarters deception of a foot patrol on a country lane. The German approach also depended on relatively bulky equipment, loudspeaker arrays, inflatable rubber forms, and personnel to operate them, which made it suited to deceiving distant observers but poorly suited to the kind of pocket-sized, instantly deployable deception that SOE's time pencils HE. The American equivalent came somewhat later in the war and somewhat larger in conception. The United States Army's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, nicknamed informally the Ghost Army, combined inflatable dummy tanks, fabricated radio traffic, and powerful sonic deception equipment mounted on half-tracks to simulate the movement of entire divisions along the Western Front in the months following the Normandy landings. It was a remarkable achievement in its own right, and it shared the same underlying philosophy as SOE's decoy charges, that perceived threat could substitute for actual force. But the Ghost Army operated at corps and division scale, with hundreds of personnel and substantial equipment, to convince German intelligence that armored formations existed where they did not. SOE's decoy charges achieved something philosophically similar at a wildly different scale, allowing a single operative or a tiny resistance cell to project the apparent presence of an entire fighting unit using equipment that fit inside a jacket pocket. Where the Americans built an illusion of an army, the British, in this particular corner of the deception war, built an illusion of an ambush, replicable indefinitely, almost anywhere, by almost anyone with basic training. Assessing the precise historical impact of these decoy devices runs into the same difficulty that haunts most of the secret war. The most successful operations are, definitionally, the ones nobody noticed at the time and few people wrote down afterwards. There is no tally of Panzer columns that turned back from a road they need not have feared, no ledger of nights when reinforcements were held in reserve to answer a threat that had already evaporated. What can be said with confidence, based on the surviving testimony of resistance veterans and the post-war analyses conducted by historians of SOE, is that the tactic was used widely enough and persistently enough across the occupied territories that it became a recognized part of the broader strategy of harassment, a strategy explicitly intended to keep German garrison troops anxious, undermanned at the points that mattered, and unable to ever fully trust the silence of the countryside around them. Its legacy proved longer than the war that produced it. The basic principle, that cheap, simple, widely distributed deception devices could tie down disproportionate enemy resources, fed directly into Cold War-era Special Forces doctrine and into the unconventional warfare training that British and American forces would go on to develop for decades afterwards. The time pencil fuse mechanism itself, refined and improved, remained in service use well beyond 1945. Surviving examples of SOE decoy devices and time pencils can today be seen in the Imperial War Museum's collections in London, alongside the broader array of SOE field equipment, small, unassuming objects behind glass that look, to the untrained eye, like almost nothing at all, which was, of course, rather the point all along. Return for a moment to that dark lane outside the unnamed French village, to the half-track commander emptying his machine gun into hedgerows that hold nothing but cold air and the lingering smell of spent powder. He does not know, and may never know, that he has just been defeated by a device weighing less than his cigarette lighter. He has expended ammunition, exhausted his men, and reported a contact that his superiors will record, and that record itself becomes one more small weight on an occupying force already buckling under thousands of such small weights, spread across a continent, repeated on 1,000 other lanes on 1,000 other nights. This was the genius of it, and the strange, quiet heroism behind it, too. No grand battle was fought on that French lane. No headline was written. No medal was struck for the operatives who placed those charges and were home in bed before the first shot ever fired. But somewhere, in the accumulated exhaustion of German garrison troops who could no longer trust their own ears, Somewhere in the reinforcements held back from the front to chase ghosts in the countryside, a war was being shaped by something almost too small to see and almost too simple to believe. A fuse the size of a pencil, a charge the size of a cigar, a crack in the dark that meant everything and nothing, and changed the calculus of an entire occupation. The Germans built bigger guns. The Americans built bigger illusions. The British, in this one small corner of an enormous war, simply worked out how to make silence itself into the enemy, and let an empire's worth of soldiers learn to fear the dark.